After his embarrassing defeat at the Battle of Bannockburn in the summer of 1314, King Edward II of England left Scotland a humbled man. Although Edward had escaped with his life and narrowly avoided becoming the prisoner of Robert the Bruce, more problems lay in store for him in England. Edward rode from Berwick upon Tweed to York, where he met with his nobles, who were becoming increasingly hostile towards him. Chief among them, Thomas, Earl of Lancaster. At York, the king was essentially reduced to grovelling. Edward promised that he would observe the ordinances of 1311, and there was a reshuffle of the king's government, as the treasurer and the chancellor were both replaced. The Earl of Lancaster, supported by the other nobles, also demanded that Hugh Despenser the Younger, a favourite of the king, should be banished from the king's court. Edward refused. The nobles, however, were not for turning. During Parliament in February 1315, Hugh Despenser was removed from the king's council. The king's household had also become bloated with people who contributed little to nothing towards the everyday running of the country, and so some streamlining was in order. With the removal of these unnecessary sycophants surrounding the king, the cost of running Edward's household was significantly reduced, although Edward is sure to have been miffed by Parliament's actions. But these cost cutting measures were necessary, as England now prepared itself for further war against Scotland, this time on English soil. Robert the Bruce was laying siege to the northern town of Carlisle. If the King of Scots successfully captured Carlisle, then that would be a very serious and damaging blow indeed. But Bruce met with stubborn resistance from those defending Carlisle. The Scots used siege engines and towers in a determined effort to bring Carlisle's walls down, but they made very little headway. Next, the Scots set up ladders against the walls, whilst their archers rained down a volley of arrows on their defenders. This, Bruce hoped, would provide his men enough cover to scale the walls. However, the Englishmen managed to repulse this latest attack and cut down a great many Scots in the process. After this latest failure, Bruce retreated back into Scotland, perhaps fearful of an approach by a large English army, led by Edward II. The staunch defence of Carlisle had been led by its Earl, Andrew Harclay, who later, ironically enough, would be executed for treason after negotiating a peace with Robert the Bruce. If the mood in England was gloomy at this time, then morale would be made far worse by the Great Famine that caused terrible suffering across Western Europe from 1315 until the early 1320s. Downpours of rain had seen floods ruin harvest after harvest, and a plague caused cattle and sheep to die far and wide. In some areas, people were reduced to eating cats, dogs, horses, and worse still, such was the scarcity of food. For those in the far north of England, their plight was made all the worse by the continuing raids of the Scots. Although Edward II could hardly be blamed for such natural disasters, his failure at Bannockburn and inability to defend the northern borders were very much his fault, and for his subjects in areas like Northumberland, their anger would have been tremendous. It was in this environment that Edward's relationship with Thomas Earl of Lancaster continued to deteriorate. Given the state of the North at that time, it was hardly a surprise a Northern Earl would hold Edward with increasing contempt, although Thomas's frustrations with the king had begun long before the Great Famine. Thomas, like many, viewed Edward as an idle man who preferred spending time frolicking with favourites like Piers Gaveston previously, and now Hugh Despenser, to actually ruling his kingdom. Thanks to the intervention of more moderate types, the Earl agreed to sign the Treaty of Leek, as long as Edward promised to observe the ordinances of 1311. For the time being, the two set aside their differences. Hoping that his nobility was more united now, Edward decided that now was the time to launch another campaign in Scotland. After Easter 1319, Edward met his magnates at York, where he ordered them to meet him at Newcastle upon Tyne on the 22nd of July. Edward then sent messengers to Robert the Bruce that he would be marching into Scotland to establish English superiority. The English king urged Bruce to make peace, but the King of Scots was understandably dismissive of Edward. After all, Bruce had completely outwitted Edward militarily wise any time they had come to blows or threatened to. Even if Edward had greater numbers, Bruce would employ guerrilla warfare tactics to keep him at arm's length. With Bruce defiant, Edward, along with the Earl of Lancaster, launched an attack on the border town of Berwick upon Tweed. However, the Scots launched a diversionary counter-attack of their own, led by the formidable James the Black Douglas, one of the great commanders of the medieval period. The Scots marched deep into the heart of England, sacking, pillaging, and committing all kinds of horrors as they went. As they approached York, the Scots were met by local Yorkshiremen, led by the Archbishop of York, who had armed themselves and hoped to defend their land and people from the invading Scots. But they were absolutely no match for Douglas and his battle-hardened men, who routed them at the Battle of Marton-on-Swale. Edward was forced to abandon his siege of Berwick and marched southwards towards York. The Scots' tactic of diversion had worked, and Edward II had been outwitted by Robert the Bruce yet again, as he had been in 1310 and 1314. Edward was obliged to make peace with Bruce, not only because of the state of affairs in the war with Scotland, but also because his brother-in-law, the new French king, Philip V, was demanding that Edward came to France to pay homage for Gascony. By 1320, more problems had arisen for Edward, this time in the shape of a quarrel between Hugh Despenser the Younger and the rest of the English nobility. In 1306, Hugh had married Eleanor de Clare, and in 1314 he profited from the death of Eleanor's brother, the Earl of Gloucester, at Bannockburn, as extensive lands fell into his control. Aside from his wealth, Hugh obviously held some considerable personal influence over Edward, and he tried to use this to his advantage to steal the lands off a man named John Mowbray. The nobles, Mowbray unsurprisingly among them, were irate at Hugh's incredible arrogance, and it was clear that the country was moving towards civil war. The Marcher lords, among them Roger Mortimer, Earl of Wigmore, the man who would eventually depose Edward, demanded that the king not only put a halt to Hugh's increasing power and influence, but also put him on trial. If the king did not do as they demanded, then the nobles, led by the Earl of Lancaster, would renounce their vows of homage and loyalty to the king and force him to abdicate. But Edward retreated to London with Hugh still by his side. It was clear that he would not surrender his favourite without a fight, just as he had done with Piers Gaveston nearly a decade earlier. But whilst Edward can be accused of being misguided and naive, he wasn't stupid. The situation was becoming increasingly dangerous for him and Hugh, as well as Hugh's father, Hugh Despenser the Elder. And so the king had to cave in to the nobles' demands. Both Hugh Despensers were put on trial, accused of numerous crimes, including blatant theft, where they were inevitably found guilty. Stripped of their lands and titles, they were banished into exile. The slightly more sober Hugh the Elder crossed the Channel to the continent, but Hugh the Younger became extraordinarily a pirate, attacking any wealthy ship that crossed his path. Most notably, he attacked a ship from Genoa, killed its crew, and stole its goods. For England, this was an incredibly embarrassing situation. English merchants' reputations would suffer because of Hugh's actions, and perhaps could expect retribution. As a result, the English economy could potentially suffer a serious impact. But any embarrassment Edward felt personally was overshadowed by his anger at Lancaster and the other nobles' attempts to control him. So the king went on the attack. He marched on Leeds Castle in Kent, belonging to one Bartholomew Badlesmere. The Earl of Lancaster refused to come to Badlesmere's aid, as he evidently hated him, and so Leeds Castle fell. Further divisions arose among the nobles when Lancaster accused Aymer de Valence, Earl of Pembroke, of treachery. Pembroke responded by abandoning Lancaster's cause and joined the king. Edward rode to the Welsh marches, where he seized castles belonging to those who were now up in arms against him. He captured Roger Mortimer and sent him to the Tower of London, and welcomed the return of both Hugh Despensers. Evidently, the younger Hugh's ridiculous behaviour in the English Channel was easily forgotten by the king. Momentum was now with the king, and he marched north in hot pursuit of the retreating Earl of Lancaster. Lancaster was eventually cornered by Andrew Harclay, Earl of Carlisle, who defeated him at the Battle of Boroughbridge, which saw the death of Humphrey de Bohun, Earl of Hereford, and, after a brief truce, the capture of the Earl of Lancaster himself. Lancaster was beheaded soon after, having not been allowed to speak in his defence at his trial. Lancaster's execution was a clumsy affair, as it took 3 blows of the axe to finish the job. Among Lancaster's followers to be executed in the aftermath of Boroughbridge was John Mowbray, the man whose lands Hugh the Younger had his eyes on. Andrew Harclay had performed a noble service for the king by removing one of his most dangerous enemies. It is therefore indicative of the state of Edward's reign that he should be executed the following year, 1323, for treason. Harclay had grown weary of Edward's inability to deal with Robert the Bruce and taken matters into his own hands. But as he awaited his execution, Harclay must have wished that he instead sided with Lancaster. Lancaster's long-running feud with the king was doomed to failure, in the same way Edward's reign was doomed to fail as well. Lancaster was an arrogant man who had made too many enemies. With Lancaster dead, Edward now rode to Newcastle upon Tyne in preparation for yet another expedition into Scotland. Again, it ended in dismal failure. Robert the Bruce pulled his usual trick of avoiding battle with the English. What's more, Edward's men had gone woefully underprepared in terms of equipment and were forced to retreat quickly, with disease not helping their cause. While staying at an abbey, having just left Scotland, Edward got word that Robert had launched yet another raid into England, and this time he was evidently intent on capturing the English king himself. Unnerved, Edward fled to York. It was bad enough that he had been repeatedly bested by Robert the Bruce on enemy soil, but now Edward was being forced to retreat in his own country. Eventually, a 12-year peace was agreed. All the while, little did he know it, Edward was beginning to make yet another enemy, this one a little closer to home. His queen Isabella was growing increasingly alienated from her husband. Edward and Isabella had at one time been close, but the royal couple were gradually growing apart, as Isabella raged against Edward's bizarre fixation with the arrogant and insufferable Hugh Despenser the Younger. In London, Roger Mortimer, Earl of Wigmore, had made a dramatic escape from the Tower of London and fled to France. It will be here where Mortimer and Isabella would unite to overthrow the chaotic reign of Edward II and end the tyranny of Hugh Despenser the Younger.